and welcome to Question Christianity, where we discuss reasonable answers to tough questions. Tonight, we're going to be diving into some leftover questions from last time. In case you weren't here, we took a few questions last time that we had thrown out and spent some time discussing it. Plan is to do the same thing tonight. However, we're easily diverted. The ADHD is strong with us, if you will. So if you throw questions in the chat, I guarantee you that we will divert to those in no time. So please feel free to drop questions, comments in chat. We love to hear from people. This is an interactive group, so we like interacting with anybody who's out there watching or listening to what we say. I mean, my goodness.
It's a scary topic.
That's scary in and of itself. So tonight I will start us off with a question that I'm hearing more and more about. It you used to not hear as much, but I think people like Peter Singer, who endorse a lot of animal rights, and he's written quite a few essays on various animal suffering topics. And so I think that kind of has helped gain this some steam. But the question is, is animal suffering greater than human suffering? And does that pose a problem for Christians? Specifically, when you think about the totality of animal suffering compared to human suffering. If the Earth's around 4 billion years old and we've got, a couple million years even of animal suffering behind us, not to mention hundreds of millions of years, then the total amount of animal suffering, is that enough to pose a problem for Christianity?
Well, so when you say is animal suffering, when you ask the question, is animal suffering greater than, you're talking about the cumulative, not an individual to individual?
Right. I would say the cumulative suffering of a species, if you will.
So could, at least to get us going, could we at least set that aside and say 1-to-1, an animal can't suffer as much as a person? No?
I would think so. I think I would probably end up answering that affirmatively.
But be clear, which way are you
that a human can suffer more than an animal due to the nature of our mind.
Okay. That I know that doesn't even begin to answer the question, but I guess I'm clarifying the question. Okay. So we got to deal with the cumulative suffering that's been going on for, well, whether you're old Earth or young Earth, it's still a long time.
And another clarifying question. So we're talking more quantitative rather than qualitative. Like, is the value of human suffering greater than? We're talking more about the quantitative. Is there quantitatively more? And is that a problem for Christianity?
I think that would be a fair way to put it.
Okay, so we're talking quantitatively.
Although the qualitative one, there's an interesting twist on that, which is just to steelman this a little bit more. Even I don't. Well, none of us are like animal psychologists here, so we're just giving it our best shot. So I don't know that we're professionally able to say that they don't. Although that does seem reasonable to say that humans have the potential to have greater suffering. I actually have some reasons that I might bring up later to back that up, but at least for now. But to steelman it a little bit more, humans are fallen, and so perhaps we deserve some suffering. And now we could qualify that a little bit, but animals aren't fallen, and so even if they suffer a little bit, you can't really blame the fall on them, and they're therefore kind of getting what they deserve with how the deer ate the apple from the forbidden tree fruit. But so that makes it a little harder.
Or that woman you gave me.
The dough you gave me.
So I guess one of the things I would. Okay, so let's make sure we think about this. So imagine you have a person dies of the most humane way possible, as instantaneous as possible, and an animal dies, are we saying, hey, is it the suffering leading to death, or are we including the death as well?
I think the issue would have to incorporate all of that.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll take a stab.
Yeah, take a stab, Charles.
Towards a direction. So I don't know that the quantitative thing bothers me in itself. If a single animal suffers once, we need to have an answer for that. And I don't know that the answer is going to be much different whether or not it was 2 or 2 billion or 2 trillion, whatever it may amount to. So if animals are innocent, and even one of them suffers once, you have God is, well, the potential accusation that God is unjust, and it doesn't matter how minor that may be. God cannot suffer a single accusation of an unjust act ever once. So we're going to have to answer the single one, and then in my mind, if we can answer it singly, then the quantitative one doesn't matter. You just multiply the reason. Now, there might be holes in that, but I think that's at least my first move.
If we're using scripture as a basis, even if it's a loose basis, and we're saying, because when we say, does this pose a problem for Christianity, is there a statement that where we could go, did the fall of man particularly affect animals, and was that a just effect? In other words, would animals, if they could speak or stand before the throne of God at that point, say, hey, I have this accusation against mankind because I suffered because of them?
Maybe we should back up just a hair and define suffering a little better, or clarify what we mean by suffering. Like if I stay outside too long because I'm not fit for it by nature, then I'll suffer. If I fall down a flight of steps, I'll suffer. It's because of the nature of gravity in my body, right?
How about if you poke yourself with a sharp stick?
Yeah, that would do it too.
Then you will suffer.
Sure will. So I'm not sure this really goes anywhere helpful or not, but I think that when we talk about animals suffering, do we have in mind just the fact that sometimes it's hotter or colder than is comfortable, or are we talking about something entirely different, or something that human beings are directly involved in, like the mistreatment of animals? I think there's a difference, and at some point that's probably going to be important.
There's a very slippery slope there, or you've got a demarcation problem there, because in some sense, boredom could be a type of suffering. Surely it's not a very strong one, but if you're really bored, you're like, oh, I'm just bored. I mean, there is a cognitive type of suffering, and so where you're trying to define what suffering is, it could be like anything short of absolute pleasure 100% of the time. So
right, and I'm not sure that justice for creatures demands that everything be only pleasant always, even in a great environment or whatever.
Yeah, see, that's
not sure.
Now we're getting somewhere, because that's very interesting, and the question assumes, and this is very important, the question assumes that God is ungood somehow if he would let suffering happen.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes back to, now this, I stem this from a defense of human suffering, but I think there's going to be a link here. And when we talk about human suffering, there's an assumption in the question that a good God would make a wonderful aquarium or atrium for human beings where they're just happy and fun all the time, because that's the chief end of man, is to enjoy life fully all the time. And so there's an assumption of what the chief end of man is, but the chief end of man isn't to live in pleasure. It isn't your best life. Now, I heard a great line by great Kokel today. He said about uh what's his name? Your best life now. It was just
Joel Osteen.
Goldstein. He said, yeah, he is living his best life now.
Which is sad, right? Yeah.
Yes. I thought, man, what a great way to put that. Anyway, the chief
At
end of man
others' expenses.
the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so, and in showing God being worthy might actually entail some suffering. It's only when you just assume. See, there's a built-in assumption that the chief end of man, or the chief end of animals, is to live happily and pleasure and pain-free all the time. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I don't think we've answered the question, but we need to really think about those things.
I like where you're going with that. Analyzing, I mean, and I don't mean to boil it down to reductive as the word purpose, because I think that a chief end is not necessarily just as reduced to your purpose during life. But if we were to say, what is the purpose of these animals? What is the purpose of people? And ultimately, our basis, our philosophy starts with that we are here to glorify God, and again, like you said, glorify God and enjoy Him forever. If you approach the chief end, the purpose of humanity and animals and existence, from some other perspective, it's going to give you a different answer.
Yeah, we really have to be careful of the built-in assumptions of the question. So here, let's take it. Maybe this is a step toward the reduction to the absurd, which is we're kind of talking about the chief end of animals, and it does get difficult because, like, deer are cute. Like, when you see a cute deer or a cute bunny rabbit, and you hear it crying out of pain, like, there's something internally, because we can experience pain where we sympathize with that and we go, gosh, that's horrible. Not many people say the same thing when they're slicing a tomato, right? And so are we going to bring in responses when you're like cutting a tree and stuff like that? And so, it's like, well, I don't know. I think we have to go back and say that the accusation here in the end is we're going to try to, not that He needs it, but we're going to try to defend God's justice, that somehow He's unjust to let these things happen. But He's only unjust if this.
Did Charles's audio cut out?
Yeah. Sorry, let me take care of that. So what is the chief end of plants?
Well, the chief end of tomatoes is to be on a burger, which is going to assume a cow had to suffer.
Okay, now if that were true, now I think you're kind of making a quasi joke, but I mean, it's not far from the truth. I mean, if the chief end of a tomato is to be sliced up and put on a burger, then it's not wrong to slice up a tomato, even though the tomato is clearly suffering for that in its own little tomatoey way. It's at least.
Perhaps for simplicity's sake, we make the cutoff. Freudian slip there. Sorry. We make the cutoff at pain. So most beetle and insect species do not have pain receptors. So you could even make a justified argument that even insecticide of certain species that are invasive could be justified for the humanly benefit and very little suffering on the part of these beetles that don't have pain receptors. So I think a fair cutoff would be pain receptors within the brain.
Why do you get to make that call? Why do you get to say, let's call it pain? Why do
I
you
asked
get
the
to
question.
Okay. Well, then here's your answer. I'm not sure you have the right to designate that as the limit as to where God may be unjust.
granted, it is a slippery slope problem, like you said earlier, but defining terms, suffering, for most persons who would raise this as an objection or who just honestly struggle with it, their concept of suffering intrinsically involves pain or misery. And, tomatoes don't have that outside of VeggieTales, right? So I think it's fair to talk about pain. It might not be that simple, but Caleb is probably touching on the thing that's most in the mind of a potential objector, right? I don't know.
That's my goal.
And are we also lumping in suffering of animals at the hands of mankind versus suffering of animals at just random acts of nature? Because one might look at and say, hey, because even if I was steel manning it from the atheistic perspective, you say that mankind has fallen and therefore animal suffering is the hands of man. Okay, sure. But what about the hands or paws of another creature?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly I'm not at fault for that based on that philosophy.
I would think that would largely depend on what somebody's view on the age of the earth would be, because it makes a big difference when you get to that point of distinction. And I think that's one reason this objection may be raised the way it is because many people who leave Christianity leave from a young earth perspective very often. So,
right.
So it's kind of got a double-edged sword in that sense of being both against God and against some of the people as well, perhaps, because you could put the blame on people in some degree if a young earth perspective on animal suffering is correct and there was no animal suffering before the fall. I personally believe that animal suffering has been going on a long time before we were ever here. So how you answer that question vastly depends on how you look at that perspective as well.
Okay.
But we can take the hardest one. I'm okay with that, which I would agree with you, Caleb.
Which one do you think's harder?
The old earth, that animals have existed for a long time and then that they were suffering before the fall of man. Because at least theoretically, you could say, look, at fall of man tainted everything. And so, yeah, animals are suffering, but men is to blame. And it would be like rape. Like a woman suffers rape, but it's not her fault, but it is the guy who's raping her's fault. And so there's injustice there, but then you get to freedom of the will. And I think there are good, solid answers for that. And that would fall into that category.
Good point. By the way, so Charles, could you also help clarify would you say that the old earth view, generally, most adherents to the old earth view will also say that animals existed much longer or far before Adam and Eve, right?
Yep.
That's okay.
Yes.
Just for all our listeners.
I'm sure there are some that might disagree, but I would say that's probably the predominant view of an old Earth non-evolutionary view. And I'm emphasizing non-evolutionary. I'm old Earth non-evolutionary. For some reason, the young Earth people not always tend to, just assume that if you're old Earth, you automatically are an evolutionist, and that is absolutely not true.
Right.
I might even say that, well, certainly a large number, if not the majority of old Earth, there are old Earth creationists. The old Earthers are creationists. Where do you fall, Caleb? Cards on the table.
I don't see. I don't like giving my exact perspective on a lot of these.
I just thought, okay, fine.
I have questions about the issue of evolution. I believe the Earth's old, but I have questions about evolution. I'm not decided one way or another. I honestly don't think it makes a difference on the claims of Christianity, though.
Okay. Gosh, that's a whole nother topic right there, isn't it?
It sure is.
We've got quite a, yeah, I'm sorry. That's really my fault for following up on that.
Right.
But
So, but to pick up where I think Caleb was going, which is, I think we're trying to solve the hardest problem. And so if we can solve the hardest one, then we've solved all of them, which really makes us think, hey, can we really do this in another 37 minutes? So if the earth is old, then animals have suffered for a long time before the fall. And so why would God create animals that were suffering even before the fall of man? Like they were designed, in that view, they were designed and everything is good, right? Everything is good. It's good that animals are suffering.
so now we're back to what sort of suffering are we talking about before the advent of humanity? Or again, are we just talking about the fact that they age, or
Arthritis?
yeah, I'm thinking more and more about that as the years go by.
A lion eating a gazelle before it's fully dead?
Yeah. So yeah, there's predatory suffering, right? But that goes in a circle,
Disease? I've heard atheists claim about a deer who dies in a forest fire. I mean, being burned alive, and no one is around to observe it and therefore learn anything from it. Because that could be an escape. Like, oh well, we learn about the fragility of the planet and how it's fallen if we see that happen. But if no one ever saw it happen, then no one was to learn about it. And even me saying it is just conjecture, so it doesn't necessarily count. So, it's a needless burning of an innocent animal by horrible death.
Okay. All right. Yeah, nature can be cruel, right?
Which I would agree is different than slicing a tomato, by the way. I'm not I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying we've got a category problem, and we don't get to just arbitrarily choose that. It gets really sticky. If I go to the gym and I work out, some of that is pain. But it's good, and it's kind of which is not the same as me getting eaten alive by a predator. I get that, but you really do have a demarcation problem.
I guess being the young Earth creationist, and no, I'm not the Adam and Eve popped out and next day they sinned. I think there was a little bit of more time than most young Earth creationists.
At least time enough to name all the animals.
Yeah. I had a really lengthy conversation about that at one point, where there's actually my theory has evolved to say that, not to get too deep into the woods, that there were actually children born to Adam and Eve. Else, why would you say to Eve, "Hey, you're going to have pain in childbirth"? Well, if she'd never had children before, that's okay. Well, I didn't know that was an option.
I could be like, "Oh, you'll find out."
Right, but
oh, you'll see.
But so anyway, the point being is, as the young Earth creationist, I have I hate to say it, the easy way out of, I think that there was a heck of a lot less suffering than what the old Earth creationists would assume. But that said, I do see how the question for an old Earth creationist can become a series of hoops to jump through.
All right. Well, with 30 minutes left, we probably should start giving some good answers instead of just steel manning this thing for an hour and then hanging up.
Yeah, right. Well, I think one answer, I don't know that it's necessarily the best answer. One answer I think could be given is, again, that animal suffering, whether old Earth or young Earth, in some way contributes to the glory of God, and kind of to lean back on a series of discussions that Charles guided us through probably about a year or so ago, is we don't have a perspective, and we're going to have to wait for an eternal and heavenly perspective to understand that more fully.
Yeah, that's actually, I hope our listeners don't see that as a shallow answer. I think that is actually a very important and critical answer, which is, and I'll speak personally, there is so much evidence that I have seen for Christianity being true that it would it might be insane to reject all of that because I don't understand animal cruelty or animal suffering. I may not like it, I may not understand it, but that doesn't mean I get to intellectually just throw out everything else that shows me that Christianity is true. I might have some questions. Maybe I'll get to heaven and maybe they won't even be answered there. Maybe that's just not in God's purview to share every little tidbit of knowledge. I don't know that having every one of our questions answered we get to heaven is part of what heaven will be. Might be. I don't know that it's necessarily true. People say that, oh, I'll find out when we get to heaven. Yeah, maybe not, but you'll be happy. You might be perfectly happy going, I don't know what was going on with that, but God is amazing. So I'm just here worshiping and good enough. And so we just might not know. That goes back to, again, the problem of evil when we've talked about that, which is, you really have to, when you're considering whether Christianity is true, it is your intellectual responsibility to take all evidence into account. You don't get to just take one issue that you don't understand and then throw everything out because you don't have an answer to that. That's intellectually incorrect. You can't do that. Well, you can, but it's not intellectually viable. So we might have a real problem here. Maybe we won't have any great answers, but that might be okay. I think I still have some answers that I'd like to present. I'm just saying that what Pete said is not to be underestimated.
True.
All right, Kevin, go ahead. You first.
No, I don't want to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. And I cheated a little bit. So I'm the Reasonable Faith guy. So I went to Reasonable Faith, and William Lane Craig has answered a number of times about animal suffering. So it's actually not a question that's new to me. I'm not saying I have all the answers, and I don't. But I've heard what to me seem to be satisfactory enough, although there might be some nagging questions. So again, maybe it's not a full answer for me, may not be a full answer you for, but I think there's some pretty good starts. One of the interesting, the question of the week, one that I was answering, and I want to give credit where credit's due. William Lane Craig let Michael Murray actually answer it, and so I just want to give credit there. And if you want to pick up Michael Murray's book, I think it's called Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, if I have that right. Apparently he has a full book that answers that. So anyone that finds our answers not satisfactory, we understand. Go read that book or maybe some other books that give a full philosophical underpinning of this. And then that would, I think if you're really bothered by that, you intellectually owe that to yourself to go get a full answer from people who actually know what they're talking about instead of us that are kind of toying around with some stuff. But he brings up some good points. So I'll steal some of his points. And he even says in his thing, this is just a start. But we talked about the fall of man. But he brings up a good point, which is that's not the only fall. There was another fall, the fall of Satan and a third of his angels. And we don't know exactly what that might have entailed. Just throwing it out there. And so there might be some blame. We know that God is perfectly just. So anything that is unjust is not going to come from him. And matter of fact, maybe the greatest injustices ever will come from Satan. So if it turns out to be truly unjust, we're not going to start looking at God. What we'd actually start looking to is Satan. That would make more sense to me. I don't know how that works, but that's what it's like. That's kind of the what do they call it? The suspect that you'd start looking at. You're like, I mean, should I choose God? I mean, who's probably the unjust one here? It's probably going to be safe. It's probably going to be, that would be a safe assumption, at least to start with, if it was something like that. And I find it going back to the intent. What is the chief end of animals? I think that is really important. And animals and plants were created for men to take care of responsibly, but they were created for men. And part of that is for eating. I do believe that. And there's going to be some suffering there no matter how you get around that. But if that was the intent, then it's not unjust that they feel pain. Not that we shouldn't sympathize.
Not to, okay, let me just say this or ask this. But in the old earth view, animals and plants aren't serving man. Well, at least for a really, really, really long time. So what is the chief end of plants and animals long before there is humanity to serve?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, I mean,
But we know the fall of Satan came before the fall of man.
one
Yeah,
of the old
yeah.
Earth views might be to consider that there might be preparation to be done to the Earth that isn't man generated. I mean,
Yeah,
granted,
you need a worldwide, you need a lot of vegetation and animal population before humanity came, if it's going to support humanity, right?
right. Again,
So,
if you take the old Earth view, which then subtracts a good deal of the miraculous in the creation account, which again, I'm not going to sit here and argue that, because I think once we enter heaven, maybe we will get these answers. I'm really hopeful.
There was a great line. I have no idea who said it. I heard it a long time ago, but I really found it interesting. And what is interesting about it is that it doesn't really matter for this comment whether it's a young Earth or old Earth, and that is about the goodness of God's creation. And what his or her, might have been what his or her point was when God says his creation was good, what exactly does that mean? Because that's kind of an arbitrary term, like good for what? Right? If something's good, it's good for something. And what they said, it was good. The earth was good before creation for the Garden of Eden, but it was also created good for the structure of the fall of man, so that in such a world it would be conducive to man's understanding who the creator was, and include suffering, so that man might understand that he needed, that this is not his home, and there's more to life than just pleasure. And I thought that was really interesting.
And I would largely take the same approach to that question. Honestly, I think that looking at it from an evolutionary perspective is actually one of the easiest angles to take, even if you separate out human creation as a separate creation, to look at the process of plant and animal life on this planet is absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
If you do take an evolutionary perspective, it is incredible looking at the evolutionary process within animals, within species themselves, and seeing the ways we have convergent evolution, where different species on opposite sides of the planet have evolved very similarly, despite no familial chains that should allow that to be the case. We just have these examples, and I think we have, most importantly, within the process, we have an example of looking at that death is not the ultimate end to things. We see that life does go on, even though it ends here in this way. So I see it as a beautiful example of the processes that have been laid out, that we are allowed to see, that help shape our own view of ourselves as humans, as well as, of course, we need a lot of dinosaur death to even be able to support the level of technological advance.
Yes, I think people don't really understand the depth of how important that it was.
So if you take a really crazy view, you could even say that in the grand scheme of things, the ultimate purpose of animal death and suffering is to the advantage of the advancement of human life on this planet and wherever else we may end up going, if we are so allowed to do so.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about old Earth versus young Earth one day.
Oh boy,
topic.
Are you going to take a stab at this yet, Kevin?
I'm not sure. I actually, I feel that I didn't quite follow actually Caleb's argument. As I need maybe some examples. So, okay, a large and long history of animal plant death leads to human flourishing. What do you mean?
Not human flourishing. Let me expand on the end. I see exactly what you mean and the point that I left off of this.
Okay.
The human technological advancement and expansion so that the gospel can reach every human being on this planet and or any other planets that we may be allowed to go to.
And I'm sorry.
Use of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs created fossil fuels for us.
They create fuel.
Without fossil fuels, we wouldn't
or
have the level of
fertilization
advancement now.
Or fertilizer for other.
Farming.
Right.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Long history, a long animal history, not necessarily of suffering per se, but just a long animal history. Which then I suppose you could argue would just going to have to involve some level of suffering just for these cycles to go on. Is that the main gist of the argument?
Yeah, I think that's a good way.
I think the problem with that argument is that there seems to be a presupposition that for animals, for us to create the fertilizer, the various substances, therefore there would have to be animals. Well, where do you get the animals from if you don't have the chemicals to create animals from? It's not like we can create nitrogen from other elements. I mean, we can't create carbon from other elements. Those are elements. They're literally the most basic of physical matter there is. You don't. I mean, what was it called? I mean, the science of alchemy, of trying to create gold from lead. Well, if we can't create gold from lead, we can't create carbon from nitrogen or anything else. All those chemicals have to be present in an animal organism to then grow up and gain mass. Well, where does it gain that extra carbon and nitrogen and other elemental mass from if it's not from the environment around it? Well, if we're saying now we've got this dinosaur, he dies and he creates a gallon of gas that we couldn't have gotten some other way. Again, this is kind of going and leaning a little on that or young Earth versus old Earth discussion, which is, I think, we didn't plan on that tonight at all. But I do think that presupposition creates a problem for, okay, we raised all these plants, we raised all these animals so that they could die and create oil and fertilizer and what have you. Well, those elements were already there.
Okay. Well, let me throw some other answers out so that we can at least try to fit them in before we end. And then you guys can tell me what you think. So we've got the demarcation thing. We talked about it's very hard to define exactly what suffering is, but we can go with the arguments like, well, I don't know where it ends, but I know it when I see it. So, like, fair enough. We talked about God's purpose. I think that's important. We talked about that we may not know, and that's okay. We talked about the fall of man and how that might have an effect. We talked about the fall of Satan, how that might have an effect. And so here's some other things. Pain is useful. It's not fun, but it's incredibly important. And there's actually a condition where people and animals can be, cognitive insensitivity to pain, or something like. There's a birth disorder where people can be born without the ability to feel pain, and their parents pray for them. Well, if they're Christian, pray for them to feel pain, because it's just so dangerous to not have pain. They have to be checked every time they go out to play. They can have internal bleeding. They can broken arm, break a nail, break a finger, break a leg, not care, keep going, just wanting to play because they don't have anything to stop them. And what's really interesting is, as I was reading through this article, is that happens with people that get leprosy, because leprosy causes like a numbness. And so people with leprosy, when they lose pain to certain areas of their body, then they will start doing tasks even though they know. You might say, well, you can make the argument might be, well, it doesn't have to be pain. It could be something that you just indicates that something's going wrong. And actually, they've made devices for these people that like show lights or something. It's like, hey, you're doing something that is hurting your body, and because it's not painful, let's go. Yeah, and they do it anyway. And so they actually stepped it up, and they made these devices so that they would actually attach to the armpits and give people an electric shock so that they wouldn't hurt themselves, and people are they would disconnect the sensors so they could complete their task even though they were causing harm to their body. So pain actually proves to be like this necessary things for creatures to survive just on a day-to-day basis and not like self-destruct. We need pain. We don't like pain, but it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important that we feel it. And so a rabbit, is going to try to avoid pain when it sees a fox chasing it, right? That's how the rabbit starts to stay alive. So it's this necessary part of animal existence. And then what's also further interesting is that animal psychologists, as I understand it, have learned that there are actually like different levels, major categories of pain. There's just like a bacteria, if you poke it with a needle or whatever, it will move away from the needle, but it's not really in pain. A bacteria can't feel pain. It has this first level, which is like stimulus avoidance. I mean, I don't like to get poked by a needle, but a bacteria doesn't like to get poked by a needle either. But it's two different things because it's two different levels of pain, right? So you just have like stimulus avoidance, which is, the organism detects something that is not good for it, and so it moves away from it. But that's not suffering because it's not pain. So that's like stimulus avoidance. Then you have the second level thing. And what's interesting here is in the article, they talk about this thing that's called blind sight, which is people who have this blind sight, so they're actually blind. So and they're not lying. It's not like a lying thing. If they do tests or whatever, and even like MRIs or whatever, like they can't see, but they can see because if there are some conditions where their body can react to certain things. So if you throw them a ball, their hand will move and they'll catch it, even though they never and they're not lying. It's not like they're not psychological liars. Yeah, they actually like catch the ball because they saw it, but they can't see. And so there are some people who think that this second level pain might be like that. It's like a blind pain. It's like, yes, I'm feeling the pain, but I'm not feeling it the way that a higher order might experience it. And the highest level of pain is what we feel. And because we're people, we have this cognition. This third level is not just the feeling of pain, but this understanding of this like self-reflective, I am suffering. Animals don't have that because that part of the brain that goes from the second level to the third level is in the prefrontal cortex. So this is why early on I wanted to ask you, like, are we talking about quality or he said quality, but like the amount. So there is some really good evidence that animals do not suffer like we suffer, even though we're humans and we tend to see a rabbit getting eaten by a fox. You're like, oh, that rabbit's suffering like I would suffer in the jaws of a fox. Not true. That's actually not scientifically true. So it's a different order, and it may even be like a blind pain. Now I don't know, and I don't.
Good example, just to throw out an example while you're talking about that. Baby rabbits, if they're taken from the mom, they've got a response that will give them a heart attack. They will die painlessly before they are painfully eaten.
Huh. Well, you can continue. Those are my thoughts. And I wanted to like go through the list and say, look, we've got a lot of answers here, including the answer, which is we don't know him. That might be okay. But I mean, all these put together, and then you add in the evidence of Christianity. It's like, it's at least good enough for me. Now, if you guys want to add to that, great. But I feel like that's all I got.
I'll just put a nuance on that. I agree totally about the levels of pain cognitively and therefore suffering, but just that doesn't mean that we're saying that animals don't have cognitive abilities, all right, or that are analogous at some levels, because And some people would be very sensitive to that if they thought we were just writing off animals as unfeeling. That's not at all what Charles's argument was doing. He was distinguishing between the type of pain, the level of pain, and the how of pain in terms of whether it's suffering in the sense that we suffer or not. And that was a really important distinction. It doesn't mean that we're saying the animals don't feel, don't think, and at any level. Some of them do.
It also doesn't mean that you're free to go like torture your dog either.
Right. That's another good proviso. Right. My mom is watching this probably. So we should all be kind to cats.
Yeah. Well, yeah, even cats.
Yeah.
Especially.
And to very large Dobermans. Charles.
Yeah. There he is. Right, Tukey? He is asleep.
So
he is gone.
What do you think about our responsibility in reducing animal suffering?
Oh, wow. You're bringing that up with 10 minutes left?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'll let someone else go first. But I do want to say something
I'll give you my example. First of all, I love venison. So when my friend Matt kills deer, and his wife can make anything out of that. Deer chili is really good. She does a good job. Deer taco meat, really good. But on the other hand, unnecessary pain and suffering to animals that can be reduced simply by us not being so greedy. Certain food providers and industries so greedy that they cause unnecessary suffering to animals that are being processed.
Man, I know people are going to hear the word unnecessary and say, yeah, so why don't you stop eating them?
Yeah, I know I'm opening myself up to that. But I'm going to lay that aside because I think most of us agree that that's actually a distinction and a different argument. But just to give my example real quick. So I pay extra for these eggs because we used to have chickens. I pay extra for these eggs that are truly free range, not just cage free, because that's a technical term that they can still be bound up and everything. So if you've ever seen the way chickens are processed, to get eggs in large industrial settings, it's horrible. The chickens are so crowded and they're on a mesh. They stand on mesh and until their toes come off and the nubs of their feet fall through the mesh. But they do that so that it's easier to clean and they can keep producing eggs faster and harvest the eggs faster for your egg cartons. So I buy Happy Eggs. It costs like $4 instead of $2, where they actually roam free and eat open grass. So but is that everyone's responsibility? No, probably not. That's just an example of conscience.
Well, but maybe, I don't know that I'm going to buy Happy Eggs, but there's something to the argument there, and maybe it's at least something that we should consider as stewards of the earth.
And I would say that allowing an animal I would say that there's something about the sadistic nature of a human which might take pleasure in the pain of an animal or another creature. I think that's probably some of the most high indicators that we are fallen as a species. When you see somebody who's just cruel to animals, even when they're killing them for food, it's if we were to look at, and I don't think we have time to even properly discuss this, but I'm going to at least point out, I think, a high point in Scripture is that there were rituals of killing an animal, slaughtering an animal for food, and it was a fairly efficient process. And I don't want to go into the laws and whatnot and try to excavate those, but the idea is that not only was it done in a healthy way, in a clean way, in a way that limited exposure to bloodborne pathogens and whatnot, it was also kinder to the animal. You're going to slaughter this animal. You're going to do it in a way that will reduce the amount of suffering. You know, it won't be zero, but it won't be maximized either. And I think there was some goodness in the way that God allowed the less than optimal things to happen, but to try to make them better. Kind of touches on our topic of Moral Monster book.
I think we need to make sure. So we're in a fallen world, and so I think, matter of fact, every single choice we make is in some level going to be a lesser of two evils type of choice, or a greater type of choice. So when it comes to maybe the decision of whether or not I'm going to eat happy eggs, is that what they're called? Or even eat deer, you know, or maybe, you know, participate somehow in the killing of an animal, even if it's just for like normal eating. That chief end of animals thing is going to be really important in my mind. Like, what was the purpose of God's creation for these things? Now, so they should be used according to God's purpose, but not abused, right? And so that's going to be really important. And it can be, you know, we have found over and over again in our studies that errors happen on the margins. You know, when you go too far one way or too far the other way. So you go and look, what is the purpose, and let's stay there, and let's not say, you know, we're not going to be vegans. That there are some people, there are many different reasons for people being vegans, but I think if you're a vegan, I don't know how much I want to say about that. I'm just going to stick to my point, which is, I think one of the reasons that animals were created is for eating, and so that we can do that because that was the purpose of some of their creation, and so we can do that, but we can't abuse that. And I would go for tomatoes as well. I mean, they're life forms. And what is he doing, netball?
Turkey.
Anyway, yeah, errors are on the margins.
And I would even say that there's a conservation thought process in animal killing and eating. You're actually helping, and I can't go out and really detail out that entire point, but I've heard people who can, that there's a conservation thought process behind it. He finally sat down.
15 loops. See, he was suffering because he couldn't find a good place to lay down.
It's your fault.
Because your lap isn't available right now, Charles.
Yeah, correct. Are you quite okay now, buddy?
Right. I think I'll just add this. I think that God made the animals for us, but God himself enjoys life forms, animals. He just, I think he enjoys his creation.
He made some pretty good ones, right?
Yeah. So we should think of that, you know, when we're on those margins, you know, especially of taking for granted what God has provided, and that it's not merely for our amusement, much less abuse.
Seems like a good word.
I think that's a very, very good point, Kevin. Good note to end on. Any final thoughts or comments before we wrap up? I think we about got through that one pretty well. So I appreciate all the thoughts and comment. It was one I was not completely clear on. You know, I've got my own thoughts, but it's one of those more challenging ones that comes up every once in a while, and you just got to take a new angle to look at things.
Yeah, we appreciate you being kind of a hard case there, because I mean that's what we're here for. I'll tell you this: when we get to my question, I'm definitely going to be poking back at some of the answers you give, because I think my answer for me is
we do and turn the other cheek. Is that yours?
Well, that's mine. I don't know that we're necessarily doing that next time, but hopefully we'll do it sometime. That one really bugs me, and I don't know where the margins are on that, and that's the important thing that we're trying to find out.
Well, go ahead and ask the question, Charles. We got a couple minutes left, and then we'll leave it for next time.
Yeah, fine. So turn the other cheek, and how far does that go? Is that, I mean, there's a lot of places where people say, well, you know, it's just an insult, but you know, if I'm getting mugged, how far should Can I or should I go to glorify God in that? Is self-defense even appropriate under any circumstance? And if so, then what circumstance? Defense of others? I certainly have some thoughts of my own, but just because they're I'm not satisfied with my own thoughts. So,
well, that's a great teaser. So for next time, that's what we'll plan on starting off the discussion with. If you have questions or if you have nuance you would like to add to that question, please go ahead and shoot it our way. We'll look forward to hearing from you, and we'll look forward to being back here, having another discussion with you guys. I always enjoy it.
All right. Well, with that said, thanks, everybody. We didn't introduce, by the way, that's Charles Graves, Kevin Smith, Caleb Johnson, and I'm Pete Good. Thanks for joining us.
Yep. See ya.